Hello everyone, my name's Albert. I'm a software engineer from upstairs at Domain, but I'm not here to talk to you about what I'm doing at Domain. I'm talking about my side project. It's an internet business called splitcommit.com, and I use mostly technology that came out of Facebook. And my sort of goal here today is to just sort of talk about this technology from a very sort of high level, how I used it. It's not to go into the detail on like the particular bits of technology and the getting started. It's more just about like the sort of quirky things I sort of hummed and hawed about when I built it and the decisions I made. So first of all, just quickly to tell you about the business idea. So it's called splitcommit.com. The idea is to help groups of friends pay for tools and activities that they've got to pay for in advance. So it's to solve that problem that organizers have amongst friends when they've got to round up money between people and book things. So the idea is that you basically choose something you want to do, let's say a skydive, you say how many friends you want to do it with, and then you can commit to pay your share of the booking with your card details, but you're not charged until you hit that tipping point of the three other friends also committing. So you can think of it like Kickstarter for social groups. I'll just quickly show you what it looks like. So this is the home page. We have 45,000 tours and activities. Here's a skydive in Sydney. It's a sentence, so it's basically, I would like to do this with X amount of friends on a certain day. Let's say the 14th, and then choose your time, organize now. That's a GraphQL mutation. You just created yourself a private commitment page. Here you can put your details in, put your card details in, blah, blah, blah. Commit it and then share it with your friends. So that's the idea. And now I'll talk about the tech side of it. Cool, so this is funny, I was at a pub with one of the managers at Domain and I was banging on about GraphQL as I normally am. And he was made a comment I don't think it's going to make development any faster at Domain. And I think one thing I've learned from this project is even though these are sort of shiny new bits of tech that have come out, I actually realized that it is the fastest way to work. And this is the best tech stack I've ever worked with. I actually built Split Commit in London slightly differently, but it was in an MVC Ruby on Rails environment. And problem with an MVC framework .NET or Ruby on Rails is that it's a multi-page app. There's no UX wow, the page changes are slow. The logic is very tied to the root, so you might have a form that submits some data to an endpoint. There's that coupling going on there, and then when you do want to do pass props to your React, you're normally going to have to mangle that data with imperative kind of data mangling code. And the other problem with an MVC framework is that if you did get popular, which is something you shouldn't think about at the beginning, but if you did, it'd be harder to scale into native apps because you'd have to do a code refactor and break your back and your front end up. And then you've also got the potential monolith that could happen. So I use GraphQL. So just to explain where GraphQL came from, I'm sure most of you know about it, but Facebook had this dilemma back in 2012 when they went from a web company to a web and a native mobile app company. So they realized the REST solution would have screwed them, right? Because they're going to have all these they're going to have Android apps, Facebook apps, they're going to have different versions in the wild all running, and you have to support all these old clients. So a kind of versioned REST endpoint solution would just not have worked. It would have just been an absolute nightmare. You got REST suffers from multiple round trips, overfetching. REST endpoints are traditionally weakly typed, they don't have any metadata. And it all comes from, the problems with REST come from the inventor. He was actually thinking about company servers talking to each other with strong internet connections and etc. So GraphQL looks a bit like this. You just send a string to the server, you get back exactly the data you asked for, and there's a strict contract with the types that you're going to get back. And GraphQL is also introspective, which makes it awesome for tooling like GraphQL and Relay Compiler. So this is what my kind of setup looks like. I've got two servers. I thought about making just one server. This would have been a lot easier in terms of DevOps because I would have had just one server to think about. But my code base, my repo, would have had front-end stuff in and back-end. In the end, I split them up. They're completely separate servers. The stuff in blue has come from Facebook. I'm just highlighting the repos from Facebook. And you can see here, for example, we got Express, and then Express GraphQL, that's a middleware that connects my GraphQL schema to Express. And then here is this is what I decided to use to get data. This server on the left, which is the front-end server, is actually quite dumb. It's just serving static assets that come from a Create React app. And then in terms of sort of DevOps, I'm using AWS for my DNS server and my CDN. CDN here is really useful because it gives you HTTPS. And then I talk to Heroku. I've used Heroku ever since I've been into software. I just find it so easy. For a side project, when you're a one-man band, you want to spend as little time on stuff like DevOps, so Heroku's great. And then during runtime, I've just done this animation to show the client kind of grabs the JavaScript bundle, the HTML index file, and then the kind of, as the person's using their app, they're mostly talking with GraphQL to get data. I learned that relational databases just work perfectly with GraphQL. They're normally strongly typed, so you can see here, this is a migration script for a Postgres database. You can see here you've got like the not null and a type, and that just maps perfectly to GraphQL. So here, not null, GraphQL string. A decision I made, which I'm really glad, is I didn't use an object relational mapper. I thought about it, there's a few repos out there. I spoke to one of my friends who works at Atlassian, and he had the same sort of thing he was thinking about. He told me that he spoke to all the tech leads at his company, and they all said object relational mappers become tech debt after a while. So I just actually used the most lowest level way of using a Postgres database, and that's writing the raw queries. And I really enjoyed this. I also enjoyed the fact that I could just go straight to the Postgres docs versus like some random object relational mapper docs. For my, some of my data comes from my suppliers API. I had to cache this data because they rate limit me. I found a really nice library called Node Fetch Cached, and all you do is you wrap Node Fetch, which is the same fetch that we use in the browser, and then you just wrap it with like Redis. And this was awesome because it meant the consuming code could just use it like it was using fetch, and it didn't have to care if it was being cached or not. Another really cool thing I found with GraphQL is that you've got this thing called context. Now that GraphQL Express library I showed you earlier, what it does by default is makes the Express request object the context. So you can see here the third argument to the resolve function is the request object. And when a user hits the home page, I want to show them products in that area. So I just grab that IP. I then talk to this random kind of REST service called pregeoip.net. And I basically convert an IP into a lat long. And then I give that to my suppliers API, and I get all the products in a 500-kilometer radius. So I just thought that was a really cool way of how, even though I was in the GraphQL world, I could still just grab the IP. The developer experience with GraphQL is just awesome. Like, for example, here I mistyped ID. IDs with an S as ID, and you can see it's like fuzzy matching here from like ID to ID. So it's just the way they're thinking about developer experience is just fantastic. Another thing I wanted to do, being like a one-man band on a side project, you kind of want to get updates of when stuff's happening on your site, like people are committing with their card details, because you want to look over it and make sure that payments are through, etc. So I could have done this with emails, but I actually realized that Slack was way better for this. I've got Slack on my phone, you can get instant notifications, and like in your resolve method for GraphQL, you can just hit Slack up and get an alert wherever you are. So now I'm going to talk about the front end more. So obviously there's lots of ways you can build a front-end React app. Ideally, you just do not want to spend any time on build configuration. And in my opinion, like the best build config is Create React app. It's the best one in the ecosystem. But the issue was it didn't do exactly what I needed. Like it assumes that you're going to use like vanilla CSS, and also it kind of has opinionated views on your Babel config. So rather than just taking React app and ejecting, which I didn't want to do because it bloats your code base, and also you can't reuse it, I just did a fork of Create React app, and then I basically what you do is you fork it and then stay completely away from it in terms of like tags and branch names. Just go off into a separate branch, and I basically maintain like a tiny diff fork of Create React app that gives me CSS next, CSS modules, and it allows me to use the Babel relay plugin, so I use my own Babel config. And then I use the GitHub compare URL to sort of show people in the wild, like, here's a create React app fork, and you can click here and see it's really not that different. So you've got React, and now you've got to think about consuming a GraphQL server. Obviously, React is just a view library, how you get your data. So Facebook's solution to this is Relay Modern. Just to quickly explain what Relay Modern basically does is you've got to go back to GraphQL. It has this thing called fragments, so your query can be made up of multiple fragments. You're all probably familiar with the 3 dots, the spread syntax in JavaScript, and that's exactly what's happening with the fragment. You're just spreading it into 2 different places. And effectively what you're doing in Relay is you're taking a React component and then you're decorating it with a GraphQL fragment. Just like here, here's the fragment, and then here's the higher order component function that's taking in your vanilla React component above. Now, one of the most powerful things with Relay is something called a query renderer, which is a React component. The reason it's powerful is you can put that wherever you can put React, right? So if I show you my homepage, this is a GIF, I hope it loads. Yeah, so this is actually 2 query renderers. That's my marketplace one, and then that's my featured one. And that's completely up to the developer. Like, I can decide where I want to trigger a Relay GraphQL query just by where I put that query renderer component. I could have made them the same component, but it's quite nice that they're separate and they're both happening synchronously. Another thing I noticed with using Relay is just like you just get this amazing code reuse by design. So when I first started building Split Commit, I built the marketplace first, and then I was like, probably need a featured section because there's a lot of crap tools and activities. And when I went and worked on this and I looked at my commit after, I was just like shocked how small the amount of code was. So here's a snippet of it. Like, this is basically my featured bit because I already had the product title, right? And the product title already had its fragment for the query. So that's the 2 things. And then all I had to do was trigger a new GraphQL query with a load of like IDs that I'd whitelisted, and then just reference that product tiles fragment. And I looked at the commit and I was like, wow, that's like awesome. Like, that literally took me 10 minutes. Another thing I found is I didn't really need prop types when I was working on this because a GraphQL schema is strongly typed. Like, that is a contract. It's never, if it says something's going to be a non-nullable string, you're always going to have that. So I didn't really feel I needed prop types. But one of the things the Relay compiler does, which is really neat, is the generated files include a flow type that you could import. So if I wanted to use flow, which I didn't because I was time critical, even though I love flow, I could have just imported these types. And this plus here is showing that these fields are just read-only. Another thing that was really cool is, like, I didn't want to put moment in the bundle, so GraphQL is really powerful because each of your fields can take in arguments. So I had this function here is called ISO field, and I have a bunch of fields in my objects that are date times, and I figured like I needed to format these date times to display to the user, and to simply keep moment out of the client bundle, I just moved it into GraphQL, made an optional format field, and then I just call moment.format here. And how this looks in the consuming part is you just pass that format string here, get it back in the exact format I wanted, and then I just do an alias field here so to change the name, so it was obvious to me that it wasn't the date ISO time string. But I just thought that was a really neat way of keeping your bundle size down. Another thing I was going to point out is how cool that you see the syntax highlighting. This is just because like Babel, Relay, GraphQL, because it all comes from Facebook, all the developers there just thought about how everything plays nice together. So that's the Atom Babel language, just giving me syntax highlighting straight away. Caching Relay, there's like, I don't think there's much docs on it on the official website at the moment, but there is this one class that they export called Query Response Cache. It's a really simple class, it's only like 100 lines of code. And a query response cache is very simple. It's just like, if you're gonna go and call a function, for example, with certain variables, you've got yourself a cache key. So in GraphQL land, you've got these query names, which are unique, and then you've got the variables that you give the queries, And there you can make a stable cache key with that, right? So if you stringify that JSON object in a stable manner, you can make yourself a cache key. So for example here, I type in scuba. It's going to take a while. It's got to go to my suppliers API, get the data. Now I'm going to type in fishing. It's going to take a while again. But now I go back to scuba. It's going to know that it's already made that query, and it's just going to be a relay cache hit. So it's like instant. And that was just really easy. You don't even have to think about that apart from at the kind of config level of your relay. Another weird thing to think about was like sort of like error handling, like 404 and 500s. So for example, to get a product on split commit, you hit a URL like up here with the product slug at the end. So now I was thinking to myself, oh, what do I do when there isn't a product there? And in a GraphQL schema, you see here the node doesn't have an exclamation mark. That's because it's a nullable field. So you simply basically, in your query render, you've got your render prop, and basically I'm just looking out for that null. And if I see it, I just return an error page, not found error page, that looks like this. And for 500 error handling, React 16 was super useful because you've got component did catch. So right, like the top of my component tree, I've got component did catch. If I was to hit like a type error, like some sloppy code down below, that component did catch is going to throw. And again, I could just render that error page, but this time with an error message. Another thing I did is like a really quick way to get high code coverage is I just made like a golden path integration test. Like I didn't write that many tests for this app because obviously I'm a one-man band, I don't have much time. But I found that like this was like a super good test to have because this is not only testing my like front-end relay work, this is also testing my GraphQL stuff. And Puppeteer is like the most awesome API. It's a headless Chrome Node API, but the way you can use promises, you can just write this linear promise code of just like clicking around your app. And if you ever want to debug, you can just turn the headless thing to false and just open up Chrome DevTools. So it's just super awesome. I found a lot of bugs. Some caveats with the way I did things. Your schema is as strong as your backing storage. So what I mean by this is like a screenshot of my suppliers like API. You see here there's a lot of optionals, like a lot of optional fields. And unfortunately, even if you want to make your schema strongly typed, you just can't. So these optional fields, they have to be nullable fields in your GraphQL schema, because if one comes back and it's null and you've said that it's definitely not going to be null, then that's a complete error on your GraphQL part and your whole relay thing is just going to blow up. Another issue with it is it's like a lot to think about. So when you're working on these two servers in Unison, you've got like, when you change your like GraphQL schema, you've then got to make sure that your relay compiler is like looking at an updated schema. You've also got to make sure your relay compiler just hasn't bugged out for any reason. So you've got like a process there that you've got to look after. And also just like when Relay's making GraphQL queries, the way I was debugging was like looking at it in the Chrome network tab. So that was kind of quite fiddly. You get faster at it, but it's pretty fiddly. Another caveat is because I was using Create React app, that just builds static assets. So even though SEO wasn't a problem for like the body of my pages, because Google will execute JavaScript, I learned that Google's actually very patient as well. So my product pages, they take like 2 seconds to load because my supplier's API is slow. But Google was actually evaluating my JavaScript and then waiting for that data to come back and then indexing that body. So that was cool. But one thing you can't get around is the metadata in the head, because Facebook's crawler will not execute JavaScript. Therefore, like if I did want to make that dynamic, I would have to go into my front-end server and look at taking that static HTML string and maybe doing some sort of replace work on some meta tags in there, so that I could, if someone shared a product on Facebook, it would have all the cool details in the snippet. But yeah, that's my talk coming to an end. If anyone's interested, they can actually go and look at GraphQL of my schema on that URL there. Yeah, and also I set up a promo code, so if anyone does want to do a skydive or anything, they get 10% off of being part of React Sydney. And yeah, that's my Twitter. I'll post the slides. I had to go over everything quite quickly, so I'll post the slides. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.